Doesn't it ever wake you in the middle of the night? The feeling that someday they will pass that foolish law, or one just like it, and come for you and your children. It does indeed. What do you do when you wake up to that? I feel a great swell of pity for the poor soul who comes to that school looking for trouble. Why do you come here, Charles? Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers? Yes. Your continuing search for hope. You know this plastic prison of theirs won't hold me forever. The war is still coming, Charles, and I intend to fight it. By any means necessary. And I will always be there, old friend.
Boker Tov, everyone, and welcome once again to our Taste of Torah. It is time for us to study this week's portion, which is Parashat Korach in the book of Bamidbar, or Numbers. And of course, it's a striking one because it involves a dramatic confrontation between two people, perhaps representing two philosophies. And it's fairly unique in the Torah portions in that there is very little going on besides the narrative. So it clearly is considered a pivotal story. And in order to understand this story, I thought I would frame it in terms of comic books. But let's begin by describing what's going on. So we remember that in Shalach Lecha, we had this failure of the Jewish community to embrace God's mission, to enter into the land that was promised to us. And in God's disappointment and frustration, a very human emotion, God decides that the generation is not worthy and should wander for 40 years so that the children's generation, those who have had either remember in childhood what it was to be liberated or grow up as free people, they are going to be worthy. The generation of the slaves simply are not up to the task of becoming a truly free people in their own land. So what happens in our Torah portion this week? Well, we find ourselves reiterating what I always like to say, that the book of Numbers is the great book of Kvetch. We have a number of figures come forward and challenge the leadership of Moses, the chief one being a fellow named Korach, who is a Levite, but also others representing the other tribes come forward and they complain about Moses's leadership. You take too much upon yourself, Moses, which is a refrain that even Moses finds himself dealing with. At the same time, there is the argument that the whole community is holy, and therefore there shouldn't be any sort of hierarchy. And it's not at all clear why Moses and Aaron should be in charge of things, right? Why you? And so this ends up becoming what in legal terms would be called an ordeal. At God's prompting, Moses challenges the challengers to come forward and make their case the next day through a ritual that they should demonstrate that they are worthy of leadership. And as it turns out, there's some hesitancy. People remember that God has been the author of so much of this, but they do come forward and an attempt is made, and it ends up being lethally disastrous in a kind of dramatic, counterintuitive ways, with fire strikes and all this sort of thing. And what ends up happening is that the rebels and their families are swallowed up by the earth. Very Spielberg, um, very superheroish, which sort of brings us to why I started out with this clip. So Moses's authority is challenged, it is confronted, and it is defeated in the most uh, substantial kind of way. Uh, they don't end up in Arkham prison, they end up imprisoned in the earth. So pretty dark. But let's start by using comic books as a framework for understanding the story. For those of you familiar with the history of comic books in America, you know this, but I'm going to tell it for the benefit of those who don't. The history of comic books is remembered as a series of ups and downs. The first being the Golden Age. The Golden Age of comics occurs in the early 30s and carries through to the end of World War II. And in it, some of the archetypal beloved superheroes, people like Captain Marvel, Super, um, Wonder Woman, these are all come into being. And with them come in their nemesis, uh, the supervillain, the arch villain. Sometimes they're just criminals with brilliant capacities. Sometimes they have superpowers of their own, et cetera, et cetera. Comic books fell out of fashion for a number of reasons in the 50s, but then started a revival at the very end of the 50s and came on strong again in the 70s. That is known as the Silver Age. And this introduced the creation of a lot more characters and storylines, the X-Men, for example, based on the clip we just saw. Then the Silver Age wound down, and we found ourselves in another period where the comic industry was not thriving. And then in the late 80s, carrying forward, really sort of to today, has been the Third Age, which some people call the Dark Age. And let me explain why these three ages can be distinguished from each other. Well, so the Silver Age, the Golden Age, represents the creation of the archetypal good guy, right? And the archetypal bad guy. These villains are villains, these heroes are pure. Captain America, there's nothing really to criticize about him. The villains, on the other hand, are pure villainy, and they do it for either selfish reasons or sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what their motivation is, but they are truly, truly villains. When we get to the Silver Age, we start to discover certain new themes are introduced, the chief of which is that the superhero, the hero of the story, actually has flaws or struggles or finds that the world is not as perfect. You know, Superman, his great limitation is that he seems essentially perfect. There's nothing much going wrong in his life. In the Silver Age, we start to see the idea, well, maybe Superman's life is not as perfect as it seems. Maybe he's lonely. Maybe he struggles to understand his purpose in life. The X-Men bring us many, many flawed characters. We also have Spider-Man, the poor nerdy kid growing up in New York, struggling to succeed in his normal life. His secret identity is Peter Parker, but also doing his superhero work on the side. But he has all the traumas and struggles of any teenager. So that's the Silver Age. The Dark Age continues the theme of imperfect heroes, but also introduces, I think, a very, very important idea, which is to explore the motivation of the villains. We have anti-heroes introduced, characters who are so profoundly flawed that we wouldn't normally consider them heroes at all. But we also find that many of the villains are given motivation that we can identify with, that we can appreciate, like um, Eric or Magneto, a Jew who survives the camps and sees that fellow mutants may be exposed to the same kinds of threats that Jews were exposed to in the 1930s and 40s. And therefore, he takes a radical extremist position, but an understandable one, in trying to protect himself and his fellow mutants. So what we end up with is the growth from a very, very simple narrative of good versus evil into a much more complex, sophisticated comic book narrative of trying to understand how to identify who is good and who is evil, even though everyone comes with a motive that they find justified, which is what makes a useful framework for our Torah portion, because in this narrative, Korach and his followers challenge Moses, the obvious hero, one might say the superhero of the story, and they claim that there's something illegitimate about him and that they are entitled to legitimate leadership. Now, the original narrative, we don't know exactly when it was written. It's an Iron Age narrative. It's pretty clear who's the hero and who's the villain. Clearly, Korach is wrong. He's challenging God. He's challenging Moses, God's chosen leader, and he is punished accordingly. And for lack of a better term, a biblical golden age audience, that was enough. It was clear who was the good guy, who was the bad guy, and the punishment follows accordingly, and everything gets resolved. Now, if we were to think of it that way, then the rabbinic period, the period of our classical commentary, serves as our Silver Age. And in the Silver Age, there is some discomfort with the very, very blunt good guy versus bad guy narrative. And there is an attempt by the writers, the commentators, to understand this confrontation as more nuanced. Moreover, the rabbis are disturbed by the idea of collective punishment for families because of the behavior of the male leaders and the male patriarchs of the rebellion. So a lot of time and energy is spent by the rabbis trying to discern, was there a logic to this debate, and why was it so important that Moses win? Rashi, for example, says that essentially Korach and his followers were challenging the very basis of the structure of the newly emerging Israelite Jewish community, which is the application of law. He presents them as essentially antinomian, opposed to all law. They're anarchists, you might say, and they think that everyone's entitled to do whatever they want to, as the phrase appears in the book of Judges, and everyone did as they saw right in their eyes. All right, everyone made their own Shabbat was the argument that Korach was putting forward, and a community can't function if there's no unifying rules or principles. So for Rashi, that's the challenge. For the Midrash, it's something that we can relate to too. You know, the 40 years punishment has just been applied to the people. And Korach, according to Midrash Rabbah for the book of Numbers, says that Korach, for his own power purposes, exploits this. He presents Moses as the elitist. He's the populist. They are living under an uncomfortable, very unsatisfactory situation. And he tries to exploit that, blaming Moses for what's happened. And as it were, inventing accusations, even conspiracy theories to undermine the legitimacy of the system that has been put in place. That's something we can all relate to. We know people who have serious doubts about the legitimacy of things, sometimes justified. And Korach takes advantage of that in order to undermine Moses. So you see some of this going on. Now we get to the modern interpretation of the Torah, and we enter into the Dark Age. The Dark Age, we start to question some of the things about Moses, the whole hierarchical system presented within the Torah, the unique power of prophets. We also find ourselves kind of identifying with Korach. He says to Moses, "Is not the whole people holy?" So he's not just a popularist, he sounds like a Democrat. And we identify with the idea of collective governance and rule. And this rule by prophets doesn't resonate for us as modern readers. And so suddenly Korach sounds like Magneto. He has a reasonable case to be made, or he sounds like Vulture in the Peter Parker Spider-Man series, a working man who feels like the world has passed him by, and he lives in a world meant just for elites, and he's fighting for the average Joe. So we can identify with Korach probably more than any previous generation. That being said, we also know that Moses is the hero of the story, flawed though he may be. So we struggle to understand what is going on and why we should root for Moses in this story. And the modern commentators have offered a number of different interpretations. I think my favorite is the one that comes from Buber. Martin Buber, the great German Jewish philosopher, also a Zionist and activist. He moved to the land of Israel and became a teacher at Hebrew University very early in the rise of the Nazi regime. And he attempted to realize his values, but he was also a notable existentialist philosopher. And for the existentialist philosopher, everything is flawed. The world is not perfect. It's a very Silver Age attitude. And so what he draws upon is the idea that there is value in the imperfection. So what does he say? He says that the argument is between Korach and Moses consists of the following. Moses is saying we need to strive to be holy. We are not holy. The people will be holy, but that is a journey that is incomplete at this point and may always be incomplete. We may never get to the true status of holiness, but we must constantly strive for it. A very existential view of how life is the journey, not the destination. On the other hand, Korach says, no, all Israel is holy. In other words, that holiness is a state of being rather than a process. And therefore, that's dangerous, because if everyone is holy, then every choice and decision the people make is automatically justified. And that leads, I think Buber was thinking about his own age too, to the self-satisfaction of ultranationalism, the belief in the uniqueness of your nation, fascism, all of those things which assume that we're the good guy and everybody else is the bad guy. And that's what we should fear. What we should be thinking about is our own status in full humility and the status of all people. We're all striving to be the best people we can be, but we haven't gotten there yet, and maybe we won't anytime in our lifetime. I think that's probably one of the most useful interpretations of this conflict, this machlochet, between the hero Moses and the villain, anti-hero, semi-hero, Korach. Both of them have an argument to make. Both of them have legitimate ideas, but at the end of the day, Moses, the right side, wins the battle. As for the question of the punishment, well, that's very much a golden age punishment. In ancient tribal societies, whole families suffer for the sins of the leadership. It's something we have difficulty relating to this day. We believe in the later biblical teaching that what's the phrase that Ezekiel uses? The father eats sour grapes, but the son's teeth are not set on edge, which is a kind of interesting way of saying everybody's punished for their own sins. You can't be punished by association. And that still troubles us today. And what we need to acknowledge is that Jewish ethics have evolved since the very beginning of the Torah. We're not in the same place ethically as we were in the Iron Age. And I think that's a good thing. And I think we should appreciate that. Sometimes we just have to acknowledge what we've learned along the journey. So, with that, I'm going to conclude this comic book episode. Like all comic book episodes, our Torah portion ends on a cliffhanger. There will be more episodes, there'll be more stories. The series continues, and I'll share that with you next week. Shabbat Shalom. No, oh, it's not Shabbat yet. Boker Tov, everyone.